We have to start right in the middle of it, right in the middle of this confrontation in Congress, because something just broke.
It did.
For years, there was this political defense mechanism, a playbook that always worked. And then suddenly it just snapped. We are literally watching the collapse of an accountability shield.
And we're watching it on the record, a full procedural unraveling.
Right.
For a long, long time, the unwritten rule really was that identity and narrative were more powerful than scrutiny.
Right.
The expectation was that any challenge to your policy or, your conduct could be spun as a personal attack, as persecution. But this time the House didn't even flinch. They just held the line on their own standards.
And that is the real shock here. That's what this deep dive is all about. You have an elected representative who walks onto the House floor expecting that deflection to work. The tried and true strategy, you're not scrutinizing me, you're targeting me, so you must be a bigot. But instead of that shield deflecting anything, it was like it became a magnifying glass for the very conduct being questioned. This wasn't just humiliation. This was, the sources we've looked at say this was accountability finally catching up.
And what's really crucial for you to understand is that the debate has moved completely. It's not in the realm of, a theoretical policy disagreement anymore. This is now about operational risk.
Operational risk.
What does that mean exactly?
It means we're looking at a fundamental question for Congress. Should a representative who has, time and again, used rhetoric that attacks the very nation they serve, someone who has minimized the horror of 9/11,
Unbelievable.
and crucially has equated our own democratic allies, we're talking the U.S. and Israel, with declared terrorist groups like Hamas and the Taliban, should that person have a seat on the committee that shapes American foreign policy?
Well, when you put it like that, it sounds like a very straightforward question. But for years, it was politically impossible to even ask, let alone enforce. Exactly. But now, under this renewed political climate, one that's prioritizing security, standards, law, and order, those words, those associations, they're not just talking points anymore. They're an active institutional liability.
So the stakes are massive.
Immense. And that is why this conversation about committee removal is suddenly very, very real. And frankly, you could argue long overdue.
Like a battle for the integrity of the process itself.
Precisely. That is the procedural backdrop she walked into. It's not just a political fight anymore. This is about the functional integrity of the legislative branch and who gets to represent America on the world stage.
And that integrity is what we're here to get to the bottom of, right here on the deep dive. Our mission is to analyze the sources you've given us and give you the full picture so you can really understand the mechanics of this shift. If you want a shortcut to being truly informed on these critical events, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now.
Okay, let's start with the strategy failure itself, because the initial moves here were, they were absolutely textbook.
Straight from the playbook. She tries to control the battlefield by immediately making it about identity. The goal is to make any procedural challenge feel like an attack on her very existence. What was the strategic maneuver there?
It's a very sophisticated and frankly very effective form of emotional deflection. We can call it the grievance playbook. The goal is simple. You make sure that any plain, objective look at your past statements is met with this powerful emotional counter-narrative.
So you force the accuser onto the back foot.
Immediately, you pose the question, who gets to be an American? And just like that, the spotlight shifts away from her record and onto the supposed motives of her challengers. And for years, Congress took that bait every single time and retreated because they were terrified of the political cost of being labeled.
So it's not just an emotional outburst, it's a calculated political tactic. It's designed to make anyone who's just trying to enforce basic standards feel embarrassed, to feel like a moral criminal.
That's it, exactly. It's a mechanism designed to create a false moral equivalence. The act of demanding accountability is framed as being just as bad as, or even worse than, the original offense. And that strategy worked for so long because, institutional leaders, they just want to avoid controversy. And this playbook guaranteed it.
But that's where Representative Lisa McClain comes in. And the whole dynamic just changes on a dime. McClain's response was so effective because she completely sidestepped the emotional trap. She didn't engage with the narrative, the feelings, any of it. How big of a deal was that shift?
It was the collapse of the entire structure. McClain clearly understood that if you start debating the feeling, you've already lost the substance. Her strategy was to drag the conversation right back to the only things that actually matter in that chamber.
The oath of office.
The oath, the Constitution, due process, and the institutional consequences for behavior that breaches trust. Her tone was firm, it was calm, and it was completely procedural. She was signaling, without any apology, that she was not apologizing for standards.
Wait, hold on. Just that simple framing. Not apologizing for standards. That had to be just devastating to the kind of narrative immunity she'd built up. How does an identity shield even respond to that?
It can't. It dismantles it instantly. Because the shield is 100% reliant on emotional sympathy, on the ability to reframe the challenge as a moral crime against her identity.
And McClain just wasn't playing that game.
Not at all. When McClain stands up and basically says that procedural laws don't just disappear because you say you're sorry, and consequences don't vanish because you claim you're a victim, she forces the issue back onto institutional procedure. The moment the debate becomes about duty and rules and consistent application of those rules, the shield, which is inherently emotional, loses all of its political power.
So identity just stopped granting immunity in that moment.
It did, and that fundamentally changed the dynamic in the chamber. It almost suggests that Congress had drifted so far into making excuses and protecting narratives that just merely stating a non-negotiable standard of conduct felt revolutionary.
That's a pretty powerful indictment of where things were.
It is. She provided that necessary rhetorical clarity. If a member breaks the rules, the institution has a process and consequences have to apply. And what was so crucial was her delivery. It was measured. Calm accountability is so much more effective and honestly more dangerous to that grievance playbook than outrage is.
Why is that?
Because calm accountability doesn't give the target anything visceral to spin or react against. It's just facts meeting consequences. The shift was from managing a political personality to managing institutional risk.
Okay, so the procedural framework is set. Then Representative Nicole Maliotakis steps up. And she's the one who brings the specific, detailed evidence, the rhetorical receipts, if you will.
Right. Maliotakis' role was to move beyond the procedure and actually apply those standards to specific acts. She made it crystal clear this wasn't about some small policy disagreement. This was about trust. It was about whether her rhetoric reflected a worldview that should disqualify her from setting U.S. foreign policy.
Which requires clarity.
Absolute clarity. On allies, on enemies, and on our national interest.
So what were the core offenses she cited? Because the sources we have really go into detail on the specific language that was used.
The primary evidence was a pattern of statements that, critics argue, went way beyond mere criticism and into active equivalence. Maliotakis pointed to repeated public statements from Omar that equated the United States and Israel, our primary allies, with designated terrorist organizations, specifically Hamas and the Taliban.
And that wasn't all?
No. She also brought up Omar's dismissive, minimizing language used when talking about the monumental horror and trauma of the September 11th attacks.
Minimizing 9/11 and equating the U.S. military with the Taliban. I mean, these aren't just differences of political opinion. Critics would say they reflect a profoundly anti-American worldview, one that should be disqualifying for someone in a position of power.
It's especially on a committee that deals directly with national security. Foreign policy demands an unambiguous recognition of our friends and our foes. And when a lawmaker with that kind of perspective is on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it raises very serious questions about whose interests she's really representing and whether she can be trusted to advocate for American security or the security of our allies. Maliotakis basically made the argument that these specific views reflect a fundamental lack of judgment that should disqualify her from that role.
But this is the critical move. This is what really dismantled the whole narrative that this was just a partisan witch hunt. Maliotakis brought up a precedent that just stripped away the entire defense of selective outrage.
That procedural move was a masterstroke of institutional politics. It was the moment that truly dismantled the partisan defense. She reminded the chamber and the public that she had previously supported applying the very same standard removal from committee assignments to members of her own party for similar offensive rhetoric about 9/11.
Wow. Same standard, same consequence, applied across party lines. That precedent is, I mean, that's arguably the most important piece of this whole thing. It completely redefines the event.
It's the ultimate strategic counterpunch. It transforms the issue from partisan revenge into institutional discipline. For years, congressional leadership on both sides of the aisle, they allowed the political noise and the threat of backlash to override the rules, to override the boundaries of acceptable conduct.
But this moment was different.
This moment where accountability and standards are demonstrably applied across the aisle is the exact instant that the identity defense and the partisan arguments lose all their power. What's left is just a judgment on behavior, and whether Congress is finally willing to say we have universal standards of conduct for serving on these key committees.
For the immediate media reflex, to frame the standards as harassment or the consequences as targeting, that entire script just suddenly becomes unworkable.
It does, because the precedent shows the rule is being applied universally. The media narrative tries to rescue a specific political outcome, but the public just watched lawmakers calmly and procedurally lay out facts, not insults.
Right.
And when the emotional spin from some of these outlets doesn't match the objective procedural reality that people witnessed, trust in those narratives just collapses even faster. This moment really exposed that the power to interpret accountability has shifted away from certain media platforms and back to the factual record. The focus is now on the institution enforcing boundaries that were, for way too long, just blurred.
And that application of cross-party standards gives the whole process the procedural weight it needs to move forward, no matter what the outcry is. Which leads us perfectly into the second part of this, because the rhetoric is only half the battle. What makes this reckoning so dangerous for her is that the procedural collapse allowed all these much heavier, long-standing allegations about her conduct to resurface, and these have real legal teeth.
And this is where the political risk really elevates into personal and potentially legal jeopardy. The whole atmosphere in Washington, specifically around law enforcement and immigration standards, has changed. These aren't just political rumors being dismissed anymore. They're now facing renewed scrutiny in a climate of much stricter enforcement.
Let's start with what the source material calls the most immediate shock.
Yeah.
The confirmation about her immigration status. We have key sources confirming that the White House borders expert, Tom Homan, confirmed there's an open federal investigation into her immigration status.
The gravity of that cannot be overstated. When a high-level official confirms an open investigation into the immigration status of a sitting member of Congress, especially when it's centered on allegations of past fraud, those claims stop being political attacks. They become actionable matters of federal law.
Especially now.
Especially in this political environment where strict enforcement of immigration and anti-fraud laws is a top priority.
And that open investigation is directly tied to that severe, long-standing allegation that she married her own brother to help him get into the country illegally, which, if it's proven, is marriage fraud, a serious violation of immigration law.
The complexity and the severity are just immense. Marriage fraud under U.S. federal law is a felony. It carries severe penalties. But what makes this resurfacing allegation even more damning, according to the sources, is the shocking claim that the FBI reportedly had evidence of this alleged violation years ago, but chose not to act on it at the time.
Wait, the FBI had evidence and did nothing.
That's the claim. And that detail raises two critical red flags at once. First, the serious nature of the underlying violation itself, and second, the alleged institutional failure of federal law enforcement to act previously. It raises questions of potential political interference or just convenience.
So in the current climate, with this institutional push for accountability, these alleged past violations represent an immediate and potentially terminal political and legal risk.
Terminal risk is the right term here. The source material we have specifically mentions deportation as a possible legal consequence if those investigations prove that marriage fraud happened and that her current legal status was based on it.
So if the investigations confirm this, the political isolation she faces would be the least of her problems.
Absolutely. When the political landscape shifts toward aggressively enforcing existing laws, past actions that were overlooked suddenly become the central focus of intense federal attention. This is a crucial pivot point.
We have to emphasize, of course, these are still allegations under investigation, but the fact that they are now confirmed to be under active federal investigation, that's the pivotal difference. It turns a political rumor into a legal file.
It changes everything. And the question of why the FBI, according to these reports, allegedly failed to act on this evidence years ago, that's a massive institutional story in itself. It suggests a failure of integrity within law enforcement that allowed political convenience to supersede serious legal enforcement. And that context changes how the public sees the original alleged violation. It suggests a system that was either manipulated or simply ignored its duties.
Okay, let's pivot from immigration and look at the financial side of this. Specifically, the shadow of the Feeding Our Future fraud, the FOF case. The sources call it Minnesota's biggest known yet theft ring. The scale of this thing is just, it's hard to even comprehend.
The FOF case is staggering. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Some sources cite a figure as high as $250 million in federal funds.
Money that was meant to feed children in need during the pandemic.
Exactly. And it was allegedly funneled into this massive network of shell companies for personal gain. This is a complex web that suggests potential political influence being used to facilitate large-scale theft of taxpayer money.
And what's Omar's alleged enabling role here, according to the sources?
The connection cited is her role in introducing the 2020 Meals Act. Critics and sources explicitly state that this act, or the framework it created, became the legislative vehicle that the fraudsters then exploited.
So just to be clear, introducing legislation isn't criminal in itself.
Of course not. But the argument made by critics is that the act created specific loopholes or relaxed necessary oversight for nonprofits getting federal funding, which were then immediately and grossly exploited by this fraud ring. It suggests a direct, even if unintentional, link between her legislative action and the opportunity for this massive theft.
And then there's the detail about her physical proximity, her association with the people convicted in the fraud.
Yes, the detail about the campaign victory party. Omar held a major victory celebration at a place called the Safari Restaurant. The source notes that individuals connected to running that restaurant have known associations with the people at the very heart of the FOF fraud.
So that provides a clear geographical and social link to the network that was operating this theft ring.
It does, and it raises serious questions about the circles she keeps and the financial interests that might be surrounding her campaign.
But this web of connections, it allegedly extends beyond just her. It pulls in other powerful Minnesota Democrats. This suggests a systemic issue.
It certainly does. The source material connects this network to Governor Tim Walz, whose administration's role in overseeing these massive federal funds is now under intense scrutiny. The question is, why did oversight fail so spectacularly on his watch?
And then there's the Attorney General.
Right. Attorney General Keith Ellison, whose main job is to enforce the law in Minnesota, is cited as allegedly receiving political donations after meeting with representatives from Feeding Our Future.
So if we put all of this together, the fraud, the legislation, the political connections, the donations, what does this mean for the listener? This seems to go way beyond local corruption.
It suggests a system where, critics argue, political influence and proximity may have shielded or enabled or at least created the perfect environment for large-scale, systematic theft of federal funds that were meant for the most vulnerable people. It raises fundamental questions about who she and her political circle are truly representing.
So it creates a portrait where her operational choices, not just her rhetoric, are deeply problematic.
Exactly. And that cumulative effect is the real danger she's facing. The damage to her credibility was just compounded recently by a very public clash involving her own family. Federal officials publicly disputed an account she gave about an alleged encounter involving her son.
What happened there?
Well, according to both the Department of Homeland Security and ICE officials, the account that Omar provided about this encounter just didn't align with their official verifiable records. And that is a significant moment of public contradiction by federal agencies against a sitting lawmaker.
But why does one, relatively smaller inconsistency matter so much when you're talking about allegations of marriage fraud or massive financial theft?
Because credibility is a single currency, and it's cumulative. When you have these emotional, highly charged claims that are designed to generate public sympathy, and they collide directly with verifiable government documents like DHS and ICE records, the central question for the public becomes, what else that she has claimed is simply not holding up under scrutiny?
So everything she says becomes suspect.
Everything. Lawmakers rely entirely on public confidence and the presumption of truthfulness. In a climate where people are already so cynical, these inconsistencies aren't minor slip-ups, they're major confidence failures. For someone already under the intense scrutiny of open federal investigations, these clashes between personal narrative and documented fact just erode public trust so quickly. It makes all of her claims, including her defense of being targeted, seem entirely suspect.
So she tried to use the identity shield to protect herself, but the sheer volume and severity of everything else, the comments on 9/11, the FOF connections, the alleged legal violations, the DHS discrepancy, it turned that shield into a giant, unforgiving spotlight. And this drama, while it's playing out in Congress, the real impact, the seismic shift, is happening behind closed doors within the Democratic Party. She seems to have gone from this protected, untouchable symbol to a severe political liability.
That is the quiet, ruthless calculation that's taking over the Democratic machine right now. Political protection only lasts as long as it's electorally useful. And you have these swing district Democrats, the ones who need to win over moderate, independent voters to hold a majority. They are desperate to avoid this fight.
So they're just running from it.
Absolutely. Polling consistently shows that voters in those critical districts are just rejecting the chaos. They're rejecting the politics of constant grievance, and they're rejecting the kind of endless controversy that her profile embodies.
So for these moderates, it's not about ideology anymore. It's just pure political survival math.
It is entirely survival math. The operational question in Washington is always who helps us win and who hurts our overall standing. And the sources indicate that she is increasingly viewed as falling squarely into that second, very dangerous category.
So she's become a liability.
A major one. Her continued presence and all the associated controversies, especially now with these serious legal allegations under active investigation, it dramatically harms the party's ability to compete in those moderate districts. The political usefulness of the symbol has just faded so rapidly, and in the context of majority control, that makes her expendable.
And this anxiety inside the party is happening against a much broader national backdrop. That's what made this whole collapse possible in the first place. What is the national mood right now that created this environment?
The consensus among political strategists is that Americans are signaling a profound change in their priorities. They want law and order restored, they want clear institutional standards enforced, and they want security prioritized both at the border and domestically. The whole political terrain has shifted sharply towards a demand for stability.
So the tolerance for disruption and rhetorical excess has just shrunk.
Drastically. The rhetoric that once defined her rise, built on permanent outrage and defining any accountability as an offense, it just doesn't resonate the same way when the public is demanding a systemic reset.
It feels isolated, out of step.
Deeply out of step. Voters are signaling fatigue. They are tired of being told that the very act of demanding standards is offensive or bigoted. The national conversation has recalibrated around stability, national security, and clear national interest. And politicians who built their entire influence on that engine of perpetual outrage are finding themselves increasingly isolated from the mainstream. They just don't have a stable political base when the public is demanding procedural rigor.
And that attempt to blur the lines, to frame any criticism, no matter how fact-based, as xenophobic or anti-immigrant, that's failing now too.
That armor is completely defunct. Americans are drawing a much sharper, more sophisticated line now. They are perfectly capable of understanding that you can support immigration as a concept, but that's entirely distinct from suspending judgment on a high-ranking official's specific conduct.
Right.
The public recognizes that demanding accountability for alleged marriage fraud or connections to massive theft does not equate to xenophobia. It doesn't excuse rhetoric that actively attacks the country you're supposed to be serving.
So when every single challenge, regardless of its foundation in fact or procedure, gets labeled hate, the accusation just loses all its power. People stop listening. And that's the moment the whole defensive structure just disintegrates.
That is the pivotal moment. Once the accusation of xenophobia or Islamophobia loses its automatic politically paralyzing power, the identity shield fails completely. It stops being a tool of deflection and it becomes that spotlight, highlighting the very behavior she wanted to hide.
The 9/11 comments.
The 9/11 comments, the FOF network connections, the confirmed open legal investigations into her immigration history, all of it.
So this wasn't some unexpected political mishap. This was, based on the sources and the procedural steps we saw, an absolute crushing inevitability. The victim narrative bought her time, but the moment Congress and the public stopped pretending the shield worked, the reckoning began.
It was a reckoning defined by a principle that identity can no longer override conduct, and emotion can no longer cancel out procedural or legal consequences. Power shifts back to the institution, the rules, the legal framework, and the key question for her political future now moves from whether she feels targeted to whether her specific political strategy works at all in this new landscape.
So what are the possible outcomes we need to be watching for now? Does Congress actually follow through on removing her from the Foreign Affairs Committee?
Removal from the committee seems highly likely, given the procedural momentum we saw and the high-stakes political calculation facing the Democrats. That's a concrete consequence that immediately strips her of institutional influence. But beyond that, the outcome really depends on the legal track.
The legal track?
Right.
You mean the open federal investigations?
Exactly. We have to watch those investigations very carefully. Does the confirmed scrutiny of her past conduct just lead to political isolation within her own caucus, slowly diminishing her relevance? Or does the evidence, if it's confirmed, lead to that ultimate risk mentioned in the sources, the possibility of charges related to marriage fraud and the potential for deportation?
So the playbook that used to protect her is now completely broken.
It is openly dysfunctional. When a political narrative collapses that spectacularly, live on the record of Congress, there is no effective way to undo that damage. It has permanently altered the trajectory of her political career. The fundamental shift we witnessed here is the return of consequence to American politics. The prevailing expectation was that emotional narratives and identity claims would forever supersede basic institutional standards of conduct, especially standards about fidelity to the nation and honesty in legal matters. What just happened in Congress proves that once lawmakers and the public decide that standards and facts have to apply across the board, regardless of background or political affiliation, the ability to control the public narrative through grievance just vanishes. The accumulated consequences of years of controversial rhetoric and alleged conduct are suddenly coming due, and that new dynamic of procedural rigor is now the high standard for every member of Congress.
That's the reality we're facing. But I want to know what you think. When politicians use identity as a consistent shield against legitimate investigations and calls for basic conduct and procedural accountability, does that ultimately damage the credibility of all minority representatives who are simply trying to do their job honestly and ethically? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. We read every single one. I'm Alex.
And I'm Sophia. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.